This is the story of 7 friends who set out on a routine summer hike in Siberia. Days later, 6 were dead, and the lone survivor described something so disturbing that the world is still guessing what really happened. But before we get into the weeds of that bizarre story, welcome to Scriptum Tales. If you love a good tale, the unexplained, the forgotten, and the twisted, then you're exactly where you need to be. A new story awaits you here every weekend. So hit like and subscribe now. It's the only way you'll keep getting the stories no one else dares to tell the way we tell them. Most people have heard of the Dyatlov Pass. In that story, a group of hikers was found dead in 1959 in Ural Mountains. Their tent was ripped open from the inside, their bodies scattered in the snow, and the official report only raised more questions than it answered. For decades, Dyatlov's story has been a symbol of mystery, proof that nature can turn deadly in ways we still don't understand. But not everyone knows that Dyatlov wasn't the only case of mysterious events taking place in the Russian mountains. Across Russia's vast wilderness, other groups have vanished, collapsed, or been found dead in ways that makes no sense. Campsites were left behind as if people had simply walked out and disappeared, never to be seen again. Bodies recovered in states too strange and bizarre to explain. And in 1993, more than 30 years after Dyatlov's tragedy, it happened again. This time in the mountains of Buryatia, not far from Lake Baikal, on a mountain ridge called Khamar Daban. The Khamar Daban ridge stretches across southern Siberia, hugging the eastern shore of Lake Baikal. It isn't the highest range in Russia, but it's one of the most unpredictable. The slopes are steep, the ridgelines are bare and exposed, and the weather can shift in minutes. A warm, sunny morning can vanish into fog, freezing wind, and torrential rain by the afternoon. Locals have always said these mountains carry a hidden danger, not from their height, but from their mood. But at the same time, this wasn't some untouched and unexplored wilderness. In the summer, the Khamar Daban is a fairly common area for hikers. Groups walk these same trails every year. It was considered challenging, yes, but totally, completely achievable. That's part of what made this story so unsettling. The group wasn't plunging into some unknown and uncharted territory. They were following a route others had walked before them and would walk after. The hikers were members of a Kazakhstan college club called Azimuth. At the head of their team was Lyudmila Ivanovna Korovina, 41 years old with a lot of mountaineering and hiking experience. She wasn't just an enthusiast. She had earned the title of Master of Sports in Hiking, one of the highest distinctions an athlete can achieve in the Soviet system. There's really no similar system outside of the countries of the former Soviet Union, but to draw parallels, it's similar to martial arts belt system, where each belt is earned after a series of exams over many years. So think of it as a black belt in mountaineering. Her reputation, however, was a little bit complicated. Some of her colleagues respected her discipline and skill that she embodied, while others thought she was too hard on her students. She was pushing them beyond their level of skill and capabilities. There were stories that Lyudmila sometimes practiced what she would call a school of survival, where she would take her students on extended hike with her with only one can of food, one bottle of water, and minimum warm clothing to simulate true wilderness survival situation. As to her students, they adored her. She was the person they deeply respected and trusted to bring them home safely. On that summer of 1993, her group included Alexander Krysin, or Sasha. He was 23 years old, and he was most physically fit and strong member of the group. He was the member of the hiking club since he was 12 years old and had completed many hikes under Lyudmila's leadership. He was also a group's photographer, and most of the pictures taken during this fateful hike were found in his camera in his backpack later. The second member was Tatiana Filipenko, 24, 16-year-old Victoria Zalesova, 19-year-old Denis Shvachkin. He was the last-minute addition to the group, and he replaced another member whose parents wouldn't let him go. Another member was 15-year-old Timur Bapanov, the youngest but still with a lot of mountaineering experience because his parents were avid mountaineers and he would go with them on every single hike. The seventh member, Valentina Utachenko, 17 years old. It was her third hike under Lyudmila's leadership. Their plan was pretty ambitious, nearly 200 kilometers across ridges, forests and rivers. The trek was designed to meet up with another team, which was led, by the way, by Lyudmila's own daughter, Natalia, who was leading her own group on a different route. The two groups would later merge on a trail and complete the journey together. That detail makes what happened even more tragic. While Natalia continued on with her team, her mother's group was walking straight into disaster. On 2nd August 1993, the group left the settlement of Murina on the southern bank of Lake Baikal and proceeded further south towards the Khamar Daban ridgeline. For the first few days, everything went right. The weather was decent, it was cold but sunny, so they moved in rhythm, stopping as needed, sharing meals, singing songs, laughing together, anticipating their further rendezvous with Lyudmila's daughter, Natalia. The turning point came on 4th of August. They were climbing a ridge called Retranslator, which in Russian means transmitter, and it's named after the old 70-meter radio tower at its peak. The slope was bare, with no trees, and fully exposed to the weather. By the time they nearly reached the peak, the weather had turned vicious. Rain poured in sheets. The wind howled so loud they had to shout to hear one another. Temperatures plunged close to freezing, and here, in the middle of this storm, they stopped. Now, for reasons unknown, Lyudmila decided to set up her camp right there on the open slope. This decision to stop was highly unusual. Just about 30 minutes ahead was the peak, and there next to the transmitter tower, there was a shelter with the roof and firewood where they could get themselves warm and feeling better. And just about 400 meters below their current position was the forest, which also offered shelter, not as good, but it would certainly protect them from the wind and the freezing rain they were experiencing right now. It's possible that Lyudmila didn't know that. Some believe the group may have lost their map, or the maps they carried were inaccurate, which is not an unusual occurrence in the early 1990s Russia. If that was the case, then Lyudmila had no way of knowing that they were only about a few minutes away from safety. It is also possible that the team was so worn out and exhausted by the weather that they physically could not go on. Whatever the reason was, Lyudmila chose what she thought was the best option in zero visibility, stopping right there where they were. And perhaps she was right. We will never know. What followed was the night of complete misery. They pitched their two small tents and tried their very best to get themselves out of the terrible weather that raged on the slope. But the tents sagged under the pouring rain, water forcing its way through the seams. The fabric flapped so violently in the wind that it felt like it might rip apart. A few times over the course of the night, the ropes attaching the tents to the ground snapped, forcing them to go outside to fix it. That moving in and out of the tents made everything inside soaking wet. The sleeping bags had become sponges. The hikers lay pressed together for warmth. The ground beneath them had turned to mud. Pools of icy water soaking their clothes and supplies. They tried to burn their Primus stoves. Primus is a primitive pressurized burner kerosene lamp used to warm food and cook. But the tiny flame did not have enough burning power to heat up the space inside their tents. Their food was damp, their boots soaked through, and sleep was impossible. Each time someone drifted off, the cold would jolt them awake, their muscles locking in shivers. That's how they shivered through the night, teeth rattling, waiting for dawn, hoping for the weather to get better in the morning. But it didn't. On August 5th, fog rolled in, thick enough to erase the horizon. The rain turned to heavy wet snow, and ice was covering the ground everywhere. Their packs, food, and clothing were soaked, which in these conditions could lead to hypothermia within minutes. So the situation was really getting pretty dangerous. At around 10 o'clock, Alexander Krysin, staggered to 17-year-old Valentina. His face was pale, his voice weak. He said they were freezing and that they could not keep going. When Ludmila recognized the dire nature of the situation, she ordered the group to pack up and descend towards the forest below. They formed a line, moving slowly down the Snezhnaya valley. They had barely made it 10 meters when Alexander suddenly screamed. He clutched his head, collapsed, and tried to stand, only to fall again. Blood began trickling from his ears. Foam bubbled up at his lips. His body convulsed violently in the snow. Ludmila dropped beside him, shouting his name, trying to hold him up, but it was no use. He was struggling to breathe. He was spitting thick chunks of bloody foam from his mouth. At first, Ludmila tried to maintain her composure and told the others to keep moving down while she tended to Sasha, but within seconds she shouted for someone to come back and help her. Tatiana pulled out the tent canvas, spreading it over the others as a makeshift shelter, while Valentina scrambled back to Ludmila. When Valentina reached Ludmila and Sasha, she saw Sasha lying there completely still. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly into nowhere. Ludmila sat beside him, hugging his shoulders, tears pouring down her face. "His heart isn't beating," she whispered. "Go to others," she said to Valentina. And that's exactly what Valentina did. But when she reached the rest of the group, she could see that they were exhibiting those same symptoms she saw in Sasha just minutes ago. They were bleeding from the ears, their noses, they were foaming at their mouths. Valentina tried to help 16-year-old Victoria to get up, but when she tried to pull her closer, the girl suddenly bit her arm. Her face twisted in panic as if she couldn't even recognize her. Then Tatiana began to shriek. She suddenly started clawing her own throat and began violently slamming her head against the rocks over and over and over until she collapsed, blood streaming down her face. 19-year-old Denise, terrified at what was happening, crawled away, hid himself behind some stones, pulled his sleeping bag over his body. From where Valentina stood, it looked like he simply just gave up. He curled into bag and just stopped moving. Valentina at this point is in complete panic mode. She's terrified at what was happening to her friends, so she ran back to Ludmila, desperate for direction, but she found her leader slumped over, not breathing, still holding Sasha in her arms. 15-year-old Timur fell next. His body twisted in violent spasms, foam at his mouth before he went still. One by one, they had all collapsed in minutes. Valentina was left alone in an eerie silence, only interrupted by the howl of the cold mountain wind. She stood there for a few minutes, terrified, expecting the same fate as that of her friends. But nothing happened. She stumbled down to the tree line, pulled on whatever dry clothes she had, crawled into the sleeping bag, and wrapped herself in tent canvas. Alone, she shivered through the night as the storm raged above her. The next morning, the weather quieted down a bit, and Valentina climbed back up the slope. Perhaps some part of her hoped that at least maybe some of her friends may still be alive, but what she found was silence. Tatiana was lying on the rocks. Denis, still curled in his bag. Timur and Victoria motionless. Alexander and Ludmila higher up the slope, frozen in death. None of them had come back. There was nothing else Valentina could do for them, and she knew that it was time for her to leave. She walked around the area and gathered whatever supplies she could carry, map, compass, some food, water. Then she said her final goodbyes to her friends and forced herself to move. She spotted power lines in the distance and began following them like lifelines. She drank from streams, ate berries, curled on the branches at night while wolves howled in the distance. And every night one question was nagging her. Why her and not them? Why did she survive? In her restless sleep, she kept seeing their faces, hearing their voices in the howling wind around her. 5 days after Valentina left her friends behind, she had finally reached the banks of Snezhnaya River. There, by mere accident, she was spotted by a group of Ukrainian kayakers who later described seeing her as something heart-wrenching. A young girl jumping on a bank, screaming, waving her hands, which immediately signaled them that something terrible must have happened. As soon as they stepped off their kayaks, The girl immediately ran to them, hugged one of the women, crying and saying that she's very scared and some terrible things happened, but she's alive, she lived, and she was okay. It took a few days before the kayakers' team reached the authorities, where they were able to call for rescue operation. So the official search did not begin until 24 August, so nearly 20 days since the hikers died. Helicopters combed the ridge where Valentina said they had fallen, and they found the bodies. They were scattered, some partially stripped, frozen in strange positions, but generally matching Valentina's story. The official autopsies revealed the following. 5 hikers died of hypothermia. Lyudmila Korovina of a heart attack. Contributing factors in everybody's death was protein deficiency, which means their bodies were severely weakened by poor nutrition on the trail. But those official words didn't match what Valentina had described. The convulsions, blood, foam, screams. On 31st August 1993, the bodies were transported back to Kazakhstan and buried in their home city of Petropavlovsk. And so the theories began. Some pointed to mushroom poisoning. Siberia's forests are full of them, some deadly, some deceptively similar to edible varieties. A few bad bites can cause seizures, convulsions, and even death. But why would only 6 collapse and not Valentina? And why all at once? Why within minutes? And so suddenly? Others looked to the water. Streams can carry toxins, heavy metals, algae. Poisoned water could explain the burning lungs, the feeling of suffocation. But again, why only 6? Some suggested infrasound, low-frequency vibrations created when winds funnels between ridges. You can't hear it, but you can feel it. Pressure in your chest, disorientation, panic. Could it drive someone to strip off their clothes? To collapse in terror? Perhaps. But does infrasound explain the foaming mouths and bleeding ears? And then the darker theories. The early 1990s in Russia were really chaotic. The military still operated in remote ranges. Soviet experiments had left its scars. Some even whispered of chemical leaks, radiation, even secret tests in the Baikal region. Had the hikers stumbled into something hidden? But if it was toxins, why did Valentina live? Every explanation solves one piece and leaves another glaring mystery. And maybe that's why 30 years later, the Khamar Daban tragedy refuses to fade. Valentina lived on carrying the memory. She had never blamed her leader. She insists Lyudmila died trying to save them. Instead, she blames the storm, the mountain, the merciless hand of nature. But listen closely to her testimony. The convulsions, the foam, the blood. Does that sound like hypothermia? Or did something else move through that fog? 6 young lives ended on that ridge above Lake Baikal. One carried the memory, and Khamar Daban mountains still stand today, wrapped in mist, keeping their silence. And so we return to where we began, the Dyatlov Pass. 2 tragedies separated by decades, but echoing each other. Experienced hikers, sudden violent deaths, bodies scattered in unnatural ways. Coincidence or a pattern? That's for you to decide. If you enjoyed today's post-scriptum tale, remember this: every weekend, a new unexplained, forgotten, or twisted story will be waiting for you right here. So hit the like button and subscribe before you go. It's the only way you'll keep getting the stories no one else dares to tell the way we tell them. Until next time.